You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio. Gods and Kings. Chronicles of the Kings.
Shortly after King Solomon's death in 931 BC, the Promised Land split into two separate kingdoms. Israel, the larger nation to the north, set up its capital in Samaria and was no longer governed by a descendant of King David. In the southern nation of Judah, where this story takes place, David's royal line continued to rule from Jerusalem. This narrative centers on the lives of two kings of Judah, Ahaz, who ruled from 732 to 716 BC, and his son Hezekiah, who ruled from 716 to 687 BC. And now, Gods and Kings.
Chapter 3. Abijah waited in King Ahaz's private chambers for a long time, hating herself for what she was doing. She had never been in his rooms before, an opulent sitting room where he received visitors and a private bedchamber beyond, and she felt no better than a prostitute, giving herself in return for favors. But the payment was for Hezekiah's sake, not her own. If she kept thinking of Hezekiah, she could do this. Abijah quickly brushed away a tear. She couldn't think of him without remembering Eliab. But she couldn't descend into grief tonight. She had to forget that this man she would pretend to love had killed him. She sat down on the sofa as the hours passed and dozed. At last the door opened and King Ahaz entered. He didn't seem to see Abijah at first, and she glimpsed in his expression all his unguarded feelings. He was afraid, unsure of himself. Then Ahaz noticed her, and his expression changed to one of surprise and relief. He seemed glad not to be alone, and pleased that she had come to him. Abijah went to him quickly, not allowing herself time to think. She stroked her hands down his arms. "What's wrong? You look so unhappy, my lord. Is there something I can do for you?" He pulled her to himself, gripping her as if to keep from falling.
"My brother Maaseiah is dead."
"Oh, no. I'm so sorry." It was a lie. Abijah felt no grief for Maaseiah. She had begged him not to take her sons away, but he had turned his back on her. Eliab's death had been Maaseiah's fault, as much as it had been Ahaz's, and she was glad that he was dead. She stayed in Ahaz's arms, resting her face against his chest so she wouldn't have to face him. She couldn't let him see through her lies. "How you must mourn," she murmured as she caressed his back.
"Yes, I relied on Maaseiah, and now he's gone."
The grief she heard in his faltering voice made her angry. He had shown no grief for Eliab.
"I never should have sent him into battle," he continued. "I should have led the army myself."
But Abijah knew that the idea was preposterous. Ahaz had inherited the fair, ruddy coloring of his famous forefather, King David. But unlike David, Ahaz was no soldier. His indulgent lifestyle had made him so unfit that he could barely walk up a flight of stairs without pausing for breath, let alone lead troops into battle. "How can I even begin to comfort you?" she soothed.
"My brother's life wasn't our only loss," he said shakily. "My army has been nearly wiped out. The Arameans are invading us even now, taking thousands of prisoners. They're going to lay siege to Jerusalem."
His words frightened Abijah. If he had sacrificed his son at the threat of an invasion, what would he do now that the situation had grown so much worse? Would he offer a second son? She had to learn his plans and try to stop him. "What have you decided to do, my lord?" He sighed, and his arms went slack as he released her. She saw how deeply worried he was.
"It's so hard to know if I've made the right decision," he murmured.
"I'm sure you have. Tell me."
"I'm going to seek an alliance with the king of Assyria, and ask him to come to our defense. It was the only worthwhile piece of advice that my counselors had to offer, and it came from Uriah, the high priest of Solomon's temple."
Abijah's heart speeded up as she pictured Uriah. He was everything that Ahaz was not: strong, disciplined, a devout follower of Yahweh. Something stirred inside as she imagined herself in Uriah's arms. If Eliab had been Uriah's son, he would have lived to serve Yahweh, instead of dying as a sacrifice to Moloch. Ahaz seemed to notice her distraction and leaned toward her.
"Do you know him?"
"Yes, I know Uriah. He was my father's student, and of course I've seen him serving as high priest at the temple."
"He was the only one of my advisors that had any common sense. I've offered him my brother's job as palace administrator."
A rush of relief flooded through her. Uriah would never advise Ahaz to sacrifice his sons to Molech. In fact, he would argue strongly against it. Abijah knew she had an important ally. "You've made a very wise choice, my lord. Uriah will be a strong, capable adviser."
"I hope so,"
Ahaz mumbled. He looked forlorn, and Abijah knew him well enough to appeal to his self-pity. "My poor husband. What a terrible strain you're under. Why don't you lie down and get some rest?" She led him into the bedchamber and helped him remove his outer robe. She could see that he was too deeply shaken for his desire to be stirred, and she was grateful. He was clinging to her for comfort, nothing more. He sank into bed and closed his eyes. "You shouldn't be alone in your grief," she said as she snuffed out the oil lamps. "I'll stay with you if you like." She lay down beside him without waiting for his answer, and he clung to her. But Abijah lay wide awake beside him for a very long time. Ahaz awoke after dawn, all alone. Abijah had gone, and he felt the ache of loneliness. He had been so surprised and grateful for the comfort she had given him last night. He wished she were still here. He was exhausted, but sleep eluded him. He tossed and twisted in bed for over an hour, battling with the ensnaring bedcovers and his doubts and fears. Everything had been taken care of, he assured himself. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? The decision to call on the Assyrians for help had made sense in the council chamber, but now that he was alone, he wasn't so sure. What if they didn't come to his defense? He suddenly recalled what Uriah had said about the Assyrians, that they were a vicious, violent nation, and he wondered if an alliance with them was truly the only solution. He cursed his father for dying so suddenly, leaving him in control of the nation at the age of 20. Ahaz had enjoyed being a prince, indulged and spoiled by his father and all the court, but now he found the pressures of his reign intolerable, the burden of decisions and responsibilities unbearable. At last he kicked the bedcovers onto the floor and gave up his attempt to go back to sleep. He had no other choice but to call on the Assyrians. Maaseiah was dead, and the thought that he might die as well made him weak with fear. He rose and crossed to the window, peering out through the lattice as if from a prison cell. The sun had risen above the Mount of Olives, and the streets below him bustled with activity. People were flocking to Jerusalem from nearby villages and towns to take refuge behind the city's massive walls as news of the invasion spread. A hot, dry breeze blew up from the Judean wilderness and rustled through the branches of the tree outside Ahaz's window. He stared at the quivering leaves, and it seemed to him that the whole city trembled as the leaves did. Fear, like a starving animal, gnawed at his insides, slowly consuming him. He stepped away from the window, afraid to watch the bustle of activity, feeling helpless. He remembered his counselor's warning about the city's inadequate water supplies, and his anxiety increased. A long line was probably forming down by the Gaihon Spring as slaves and servant girls made their way through the water gate and down the steep ramp, balancing clay jars on their heads. Water would be as crucial to his nation's defenses as swords and spears, yet Jerusalem had no source of fresh water within its walls. The Gaihon Spring and aqueduct lay outside of them. But a solution to the problem eluded him. Maybe he shouldn't remain idle, hiding in his rooms as his nation prepared for the siege. He needed to make a public appearance, to be visible to the people of Jerusalem, to convince them that he was confident and unafraid. After all, that was a great king's duty in a time of crisis. And maybe he could convince himself as well. He decided to take an inventory of his water supplies himself, and he rang for his servant. The man entered with his head lowered, bowing like a dog about to be beaten. "Forgive me, my lord," he muttered as he touched his forehead to the floor. "I don't know how the boy managed to slip past me." At first Ahaz had no idea what his servant was talking about. Then he recalled his son's outrageous appearance in the council room, and his anger flared.
"You should have been at your post. It could have been an intruder instead of my son. You know my enemies are plotting to kill me."
"I swear to all the gods that it will never happen again, my lord. Please have mercy."
"I should have you beaten, or maybe I should beat you myself, but there's no time for it. Get up. We have a siege to prepare for."
"Thank you, my lord, thank you." The man scrambled to his feet, bowing repeatedly.
"What did you do with him?"
"With your son, my lord?"
"Who else are we talking about?" "Yes, my son."
The words sounded peculiar to Ahaz, as if he'd spoken of his son for the first time. His sons had never seemed like real people to him, merely faceless infants, possessions under his sovereign control. Until last night, that is. Twice he had seen his son face to face, and looked into his accusing eyes. "I took the boy to his room, your majesty."
"Bring him here."
But he's only a child, my lord. He didn't mean any harm."
"I said, bring him here."
Ahaz stared out the window as he waited for the servant to return, and he felt pleased when his son bowed properly in respect when he finally entered. Abijah's son had been well trained. Ahaz suddenly recalled her request to be his favorite wife, and knew she undoubtedly wanted her son to be chosen as his heir, instead of one of his concubine's sons. But there was plenty of time for that, wasn't there? This boy was a mere child. And he was a fine-looking boy, with Abijah's wide brown eyes and tawny skin. His dark hair had a coppery cast, inherited from Ahaz's own family line, the House of David.
"You are Eliab?"
he guessed. The boy looked startled, then shook his head. "I'm Hezekiah." Ahaz remembered then. Eliab had been his firstborn, his gift to Molech. He recalled the way Eliab's small body had tumbled helplessly into the flames, and he shuddered. He stared down at Hezekiah, trying to determine what emotion he read in his dark eyes. Fear? Yes, certainly fear, but something else as well.
"So, I find you everywhere, it seems. Sleeping in my wife's chambers, inviting yourself to my council meetings. Maybe you would like to be the king in my place?"
Hezekiah didn't answer. He stood very still, staring up at him, his gaze never wavering. Suddenly Ahaz deciphered the look in Hezekiah's eyes, and his jaw dropped in astonishment. It was hatred.
"How Dare you? Ahaz barely restrained himself from slapping him. Someday you'll be in my place. Someday you'll see what it's like to face one crisis after another. You'll be the one who has to make decisions, regardless of the cost. Do you think it's so easy? Hezekiah's eyes filled with tears, but he remained in control of himself. Ahaz had to admit that his son had courage, and he suddenly felt foolish for losing his temper. "Why am I wasting my breath on a child?" he muttered. "So, you enjoy following me around? Get dressed. You can accompany me on my inspection tour." "Get him ready," he told his servant. "He's coming with me." An hour later, with his son by his side, Ahaz walked down the long main street of Jerusalem with his entourage, inspecting the levels of rainwater in the city cisterns. The fact that most of them were barely half full distressed him. Swarms of curious citizens joined in the procession, children and servant girls and farmers fleeing the surrounding countryside, along with city elders and noblemen who were hoping to be noticed and acknowledged by the king. At first Ahaz tried to appear dignified and older than his years, but soon the sight of so many people looking to him for strength and trusting him for deliverance began to heighten his anxiety. He felt the weight of his responsibility like an enormous burden, as if he were required to carry everyone on his shoulders. The load exhausted him, and the siege hadn't even begun yet. When he finished examining the cisterns, he led the procession out of the city through the southeast gate to the Shiloah Pool, a man-made reservoir built to hold the overflow from the Gihon spring and supply the southern section of the city with water. From there he followed the aqueduct up the Kidron Valley, coming at last to the spring. But once he reached it, Ahaz found that there was little for him to do except stand and stare into the water, in spite of his grand procession. The city's protecting walls on the cliff above his head receded in the distance, like a fading mirage, and the gap between the walls and the spring seemed infinite. He could see no way to defend the spring against the enemy, and he wondered how long Jerusalem could survive without fresh water. Long enough for the Assyrians to come to his defense, if they came at all. Ahaz's plans seemed useless to him now, like a dream that makes sense during the night, but turns absurd in the light of day. The waters of Gihon were black and cold and deep, as if no bottom existed. Ahaz stared at the spring, not really seeing it, and saw instead the defeat of his city and his own certain death. This inspection tour had been a mistake. He felt worse than before. What's more, he no longer had his brother by his side, but his son, a mere child. With Maaseiah dead, Ahaz had no one to turn to with his doubts and fears. He could only hold his feelings inside, turning them around and around in his mind until they sucked his soul down into the darkness of depression. He stood immobilized. The crowd grew still. The procession waited in awkward silence. Dimly he heard the rustle of robes and footsteps approaching on the path. Ahaz looked up as the crowd parted, and he recognized the slender, aristocratic man walking toward him, holding a small boy by the hand. His distant cousin's regal bearing and reddish beard confirmed his kinship to Ahaz and the royal line of King David. Father and son bowed in respect, then stood before Ahaz and his son. "What do you want, Isaiah?" Ahaz asked. "This is my firstborn son, Shear-Jashub," Isaiah answered quietly. His eyes bore into Ahaz, and he knew it was an accusation. His own firstborn son was dead. The strange name Shear-Jashub meant a remnant will return, just as a mere remnant of Ahaz's army would return. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" Ahaz said. "What do you want?" "I have a word of advice for you." "Advice? I might have known. You'd like a position in my court, now that I've lost my 3 top men."
Isaiah shook his head. "No. I've renounced my kinship to the house of David, because—"
"You were thrown out of the palace," Ahaz interrupted, "and for good reason. My father didn't want to listen to your radical opinions, and neither do I."
Isaiah took a step closer. "How can I remain silent when my nation is rushing toward disaster? Unless Judah reforms—"
"Reforms? If we listened to you, we'd end up living in tents like Abraham."
Isaiah held his head high, meeting Ahaz's gaze without flinching. He repeated quietly, "Unless this nation repents."
"That's enough." Ahaz held up his hands. "We don't need a doomsayer, Isaiah. The people are already worried. You can't get an audience in my court, so you force your views on the common people and call it prophecy. Well, I don't want to listen to you, and neither do they."
"I have a word for you, King Ahaz, from Yahweh." Isaiah's tone changed, and there was something in his manner, an unmistakable authority in his voice, that made Ahaz keep silent. "Be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid," Isaiah told him. "Don't lose heart because of these kings who have come against you."
"What are you talking about?" Ahaz exploded. "Their armies are rapidly approaching Jerusalem."
"Yes, but the Lord God says their plan will not succeed. You must stand firm in your faith in Yahweh, or you will not stand at all."
"I don't know where you get your bizarre ideas, and I don't care. I've already made plans to deal with this crisis, and I'm not changing them now."
Isaiah's eyes narrowed. "You don't believe that Yahweh can deliver you from the enemy, do you? You'd rather ask the king of Assyria for help than put your trust in the Lord." Ahaz glared at him, wondering how he had learned of the planned alliance so quickly.
"The gods belong in the temples, not in the streets," Ahaz said, "and certainly not in government."
Isaiah took another step forward. "Ask Yahweh for a sign. Let him prove that he will crush your enemies as he has said. Ask anything you like, in heaven or on earth."
"No, I won't put Yahweh to the test."
Isaiah's confidence shook Ahaz. If his cousin somehow produced a miracle in front of all these people, Ahaz would have to abandon his plans and trust in the sign. He couldn't afford to take that risk. "Hear now, you house of David," Isaiah said angrily. His quiet voice grew and surged as he spoke, like water rushing down a dry riverbed until it seemed to thunder. "You're not satisfied to exhaust my patience. You'll exhaust the Lord's patience as well. Very well, then. Yahweh himself will choose the sign. A virgin shall conceive and give birth to a child, and he shall be called Emmanuel."
"That's ridiculous. How can a virgin bear a child?"
"The lands of the kings you dread so much will be laid waste," Isaiah continued. "But Yahweh will bring a terrible curse on you and on your nation and on your family, too. The mighty king of Assyria will come with his great army. Yahweh will take these Assyrians you've hired to save you and use them to shave off everything you have, your head and the hair of your legs and your beard also." Ahaz didn't want to hear any more. He turned his back on Isaiah and strode toward the steep ramp that led up to the city, anxious to escape his cousin's words. They were too horrible to consider. What if Isaiah was right? What if the Assyrians decided to invade him instead of rescuing him? He glanced over his shoulder to see if Isaiah had followed him, and he saw Hezekiah behind him, gazing up at him with accusing eyes. Ahaz quickly turned away. He led his procession back to the palace as quickly as he could, refusing to acknowledge the gawking crowds who clamored for a glimpse of their king. Then he sent Hezekiah away with a servant and returned to his own bedchamber, deeply depressed. Outside his window, the frantic preparations for the siege continued, but Ahaz no longer sought comfort in activity. The hole inside, where fear gnawed at him, felt even larger. He didn't want to be king anymore. He wished that someone else could rule instead of him. But his brother Maaseiah was dead, and Ahaz was alone. There was no one else. He lay face down on his bed and wept. Uriah sat in the temple council chamber and planned his strategy, ignoring the arguing priests and Levites. His head pounded from tension as the meeting dragged on and on. The overcrowded room, a smaller version of the king's council chamber, felt charged with emotion. He had asked his uncle, Azariah, the retired high priest, to preside over the meeting from his place on the raised dais. The others sat in a semicircle around him. But after the announcement of King Ahaz's decision to raise tribute for Assyria, the meeting had quickly reached a stalemate as the priests argued over which section of the holy place should be dismantled for its gold. Uriah closed his eyes and squeezed his throbbing temples with his fingertips. "This is what I hate," he mumbled to the priest seated beside him. "These fools can't even reach a simple consensus. No wonder the people have deserted the worship of Yahweh." The priest yawned. "Do you suppose they'll finish in time for the evening sacrifice?" "Not at this rate. I don't know how the temple has managed to survive this long, but I can see how it will end." Uriah sighed and tried to concentrate on the discussion again. He hadn't mentioned his promotion yet, or Ahaz's decision to offer another sacrifice to Molech. He would need to handle those subjects with great care. Let the men exhaust their energy arguing over the Assyrian tribute first. After what seemed like hours, the priests finally reached an agreement. Like a proud noblewoman taken captive, the temple would be stripped of her finery to pay for the tribute to Assyria. Azariah divided the work among the men and was about to dismiss the gathering when Uriah rose from his place. "Just a moment, gentlemen. There is one more matter we need to discuss." The men groaned with fatigue, but Uriah took his time, choosing every word, every gesture, with care. He must win their support. There was no other option. "At the emergency council meeting this morning, King Ahaz asked me to replace Prince Maaseiah as palace administrator. I have decided to accept the position." His words were met with stunned silence. He had expected applause, or at least words of congratulations, but the room grew very still. He decided to lay everything before them at once, while they were still in shock, and get it over with quickly. "One of my first duties as palace administrator is to organize a public sacrifice before the siege begins." "Here, at the temple?" Azariah asked. "No. Ahaz plans to offer another sacrifice to Molech." Conaniah jumped to his feet as if he might strike Uriah. "Have you lost your mind? How can you possibly organize a sacrifice to idols? You're the high priest of Yahweh." "He's right," Azariah said. "I don't see how you can possibly serve as palace administrator to a king who worships Molech. It's out of the question. You've gone too far, Uriah." Their protests opened the floodgate, and everyone began talking and shouting at once. Uriah's head felt as if it would burst. "Let me finish," he finally shouted above the noise. "At least listen to me before you condemn me." Azariah began calling for silence and eventually restored the meeting to order. When everyone was seated, Uriah began to slowly circle the men, his voice calm and authoritative. As he spoke, he fixed his intimidating gaze on each priest and Levite in turn, a silent warning not to defy him. Most of the men would respect him enough to follow his lead if he could make his words persuasive enough, and if he could silence his opponents. "We serve a dead institution,"
he began. "Look around you. Even the building is crumbling down on us, and we don't have the resources to repair it. It's time we faced the truth. The men of Jerusalem are no longer willing to support this temple or its priesthood with their tithes. Like the king, they go elsewhere for spiritual help, to the idols and shrines in the groves. Meanwhile, we barely take in enough offerings to keep our families alive. It's time to make some changes." "How can you talk about change?" Azariah interrupted. "Yahweh never changes. He ordained all the laws and the sacrifices, even the pattern for the temple itself. You don't have the authority to change what the Almighty One has commanded." "I have not finished speaking," Uriah shouted, forcing himself to take authority over his elderly uncle. "You'll have a chance to speak when I'm through." Azariah sat down, but his face was white, his lips taut with anger. The tension in the room swelled as Uriah continued. "Our temple worship must change as the world changes, or it will eventually die out altogether. We're so bound to tradition that we no longer listen to the people. I'm not talking about changing Yahweh's laws. I'm talking about examining our traditions. If the men of Judah are drawn to the religions of the nations around us, then we need to ask ourselves why. It's time we consider changing our outmoded traditions to fit the times, instead of blindly clinging to the old ways." Azariah could no longer restrain himself. "That's outrageous!" he shouted. "Don't listen to him!" The room erupted into chaos. Uriah watched helplessly, wondering how he would ever restore order again. After several frustrating minutes, he began to shout, "Quiet, all of you! Be quiet and listen to me! Are you going to think for yourselves, or let a few closed-minded extremists think for you?" Eventually, most of the men quieted. Uriah ignored the few scattered objections and continued speaking, his voice hoarse from the strain. "If this temple is going to survive, it's essential that we have the king's support. The people follow his leadership in spiritual matters. You know that. Some of you can remember how it was when Uzziah was king. This temple was the focal point of the nation because of him." He turned to Zechariah. "Tell them how you won Uzziah's confidence and were able to influence the entire nation." Zechariah made a shaky attempt to stand and speak, but Uriah quickly realized from his glazed eyes and swaying legs that he was drunk. Uriah hastily resumed his speech. "My esteemed colleague has already assured me of his full support," he said, as he waved Zechariah away. "My point is that King Ahaz is very young and has no understanding of Yahweh's law. It's up to us to teach him and draw him back to the worship of Yahweh. Then we'll be able to draw back the people as well. King Ahaz trusts me. He has made me second in command of the nation. I'm merely using this sacrifice as a first step to revive the worship at this temple." "By worshipping idols?" Conaniah shouted. "You want to revive the worship of Yahweh by sacrificing to Molech? That's insane. The only way to revive temple worship is through repentance. The men of Judah must give up their idolatry and turn their hearts back to God." Uriah swiftly crossed the room and stood before Conaniah, towering over him in an unspoken threat. "This temple has been trying to operate under your narrow-minded, archaic views long enough. Repentance! Where has that gotten us? The whole purpose of this temple is to serve the spiritual needs of the people. Obviously, our traditions aren't meeting those needs, or the people would come back. First, we must draw them back to worship. Later, we can wean them from their idolatry." "No," You're wrong, Azariah said. The purpose of this temple is to serve Yahweh, not the people. We sin against him if we lead the people into idolatry. We're not leading them into idolatry, Uriah shot back. They're already worshipping idols. We can sit here and starve to death from lack of offerings, or we can change and reclaim some of our former power and strength in this nation. This is our chance. I have the king's trust and support. If I don't take a leading role in this sacrifice, then Molech's priests will. Look, I'm simply making all the arrangements. Molech's priests will perform the ritual, but the people must be convinced that our priesthood is supreme over all others. Absolutely not, Azariah answered. We're priests of the one true God. We can't give our consent to idolatry. Our consent isn't an issue, Uriah shouted. Ahaz is stripping the last of the temple's wealth. Don't you understand that? There's nothing left. Are you going to sit here, clinging to the past, while the building crumbles down around you? He slammed his fist against the wall with such force that bits of plaster and dust fell from the ceiling as if to prove his words. The room was silent for a moment. It's getting very late, Uriah said, his voice calm and controlled. We've debated long enough. We have to carry out the king's orders today. The tribute must be sent to Assyria before the siege begins, and the sacrifice must be held immediately. We can't waste any more time arguing. It's time to vote. He ignored the scattered murmurs of dissent and scooped up the container of pebbles used for voting. As he passed it around, each man took one black and one white stone. If you wish to support me as high priest and revive our temple worship, put in the white stone, he ordered. If you wish to tie my hands with your antiquated traditions and wait for the temple to fall down around you, put in the black stone. Don't listen to him, Azariah pleaded. He's giving us no choice. That's because there is no choice. Don't you understand that? We're the dying custodians of a dying institution. We need change. Now, vote. No! Azariah hurled his stones at Uriah's feet. I refuse to accept your leadership. I refuse to have any part in a vote for idolatry. The very idea is an abomination to God himself. He strode from the room. Conaniah and a few others followed. Uriah held his breath, waiting to see how many more would leave. When enough men remained for their decision to be legally binding, he exhaled. He quickly passed the box for the vote, listening to the dull thud of the stones as they hit the bottom. When it came around to him, he tossed in his white stone, then turned the box over and dumped its contents in the middle of the circle. Count them, he ordered. He could tell by the mixture of black and white that the vote would be close. Uriah watched tensely as two scribes separated and counted the stones. If the vote went against him, he would have to resign as high priest. His authority over the priests and Levites and his power to make changes in the temple would come to an end. But if he won, today would bring a new beginning. 23 black, the first scribe announced, and 28 white, the second one added. The vote has gone in your favor, Uriah. They passed the container to collect the unused stones, and the men silently filed out, exhausted from the emotional strain of the meeting. When he was alone, Uriah sank onto his uncle's seat on the dais, staring at the stones still piled in the center of the room. He had won. He had a new position of power with the king, and now the priests and Levites supported his leadership as well. His whole life had shifted in the past few hours and had finally come into focus.
Uriah knew he should be elated, but his victory left him with a hollow feeling inside that he was afraid to examine too closely. He would wait until the sacrifice to Molech was over, he told himself. Maybe then he would feel differently. Maybe then he could silence the nagging voice that haunted him.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.